there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Minutes, board meeting March 29th, 2022. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right, reporting, there's nothing to report out of closed session, so we'll go straight to board report. We'll start with our student trustee, Ms. Wazano.
Hi. So for Terra Nova, we started state testing on Monday. So that's been going on. And then at school, we're also doing a dodgeball tournament. So that's been going on every day during lunch, which has been fun to watch. And then prom tickets have started to sell. And then last week on Friday, I believe it was, we had a senior field day where they had like suits and dresses and other accessories that students were able to take for prom, along with games that included prizes like a free prom ticket or like a free suit rental. So that went on, and that's been, yeah, that was good. And that's all I have to report.
Ms. Garrett.
I hope everyone had a restful spring break, and other than that, I don't have anything to report.
Salvador.
So really quickly, we've had good meetings with members that are participating in the garden. We had a few good meetings, and that's been great. We had a nice report out at the San Mateo County School Boards Association about our development, which was really well received, so that was fantastic. And I have been having meetings, advocacy meetings with legislators, because it's Ledge Week, and those have been going good.
Ooh, fantastic. I was at some of those same meetings that you attended, so I don't really have anything else to add. I did have the Pacifica Joint Articulation meeting last week, which was City of Pacifica, us, PSD, and the North Coast County Water District. And then I also attended PSD's open houses for their workforce housing development. So definitely some good info there. Ms. Baca.
Nothing to report for me. Thank you.
Okay. AFT 1481. Okay. Fantastic. And do we have a COVID response tonight? Okay.
Good evening. Nice to see you all. So here's my report. COVID-19 cases are on the rise, but San Mateo County is still considered to have low transmission according to both the state and the CDC. To give some perspective, on March 30th, we reached a low post-surge 7-day lagged case rate, average reported by the state, of 6.6 cases per 100,000 in the population. Since this low, the case rate has increased. As of April 14th, the case rate was 61.7 cases per 100,000 in San Mateo County, and as of today, it's 153.92 cases per 100,000 in the population. While this represents an increase from our low, this rate still remains relatively low compared to the height of the recent surge of 239 cases per 100,000 population in early January. Within JUHSD, we have seen a similar trend. In January, we had 443 positive cases reported. In February, we had 103 positive cases reported. In March, we had a total of 18 cases reported. And as of today, we have 32 cases reported to date for April. One thing to be aware of is that the definition of the level of community spread has changed to no longer be based on the number of cases, but rather on hospitalizations. So while the current Omicron variant BA.2 is highly contagious, it does not appear to be causing severe disease and hospitalizations. The county reports that 83.7% of the population is fully vaccinated, with 90.3% of the population aged 12 and over being fully vaccinated. We're currently in communication with CARE, the California Immunization Registry, to get specific vaccination rates for JUHSD students. The state of California has also postponed the student vaccination mandate to July 1st, 2023. So based on the current low level of community spread, the CDC recommends wearing masks according to your personal preference. The California Department of Public Health continues to strongly recommend wearing a well-fitting N95 or KN95 mask indoors, which we have available at each school site. That's it.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to consent.
Yeah, welcome everybody. First, I just want to say I'm glad that we are discussing some of the items on the agenda today. Some of them are long time coming. Secondly, too, is the is the week of Earth Day, and it's good to see students not only honoring that, but doing it justice and elevating a lot of the issues in our community that span from environmental justice to social justice, and what that means on a deeper level in terms of intersectional issues and in terms of what that means not just globally, but locally here in North San Mateo County. So with that said, I was going to speak to COVID and kind of where we are. I know as a teacher, we're seeing some differences, and we're also seeing some positive cases, but it's reassuring to see that things have slowed down a little bit. Just want to urge that caution, because here in North County, we do have a lot of essential workers, even in retail, and so as we get ready for summer, to be vigilant and, lean in terms of, looking out for one another and each other's, physical and mental health conditions as we move into the summer. And so looking forward to closing the semester on a strong note and the rest of our agenda today. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, item 12, consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve consent?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. And with that, I want to welcome our new principal, incoming principal for Oceana High School, Ms. Maritza Torres. Would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I'll just say that I am very honored and excited to serve Oceana in this new role. I'm feeling more emotional than I thought it was. This is a big step, and I'm just really excited for this transition, and I'm looking forward to working with staff and community and students on to keep Oceana going. So thank you.
Fantastic. Welcome. All right, item 13, public comment. Do we have any public comment this evening?
No, we do not have any at this time.
Let's move on to item 14A. I believe this is so the renaming of JHSC and Jefferson High School, and this was a request from Mr. Achapinti for quite some time. So, Mr. Achapinti, would you like to kick off the discussion, please?
Yes, thank you. This isn't obviously the first time this has been brought up. This is something that I think many people, not just here in our community, in our district, but across the country and, of course, globally, have considered in terms of rethinking and reimagining our communities, starting with how we identify and working in the public interest. And I think that the renaming of schools, while it has been, for some, controversial in the sense that it's a step away from the past and tradition and nostalgia, the issues are much bigger when confronted with the reality that we have a right to have our own voices and our own identities and communities not only acknowledged, but of course the Native and Indigenous communities to whom land belongs, and ultimately the right to self-determination to claim and reclaim that land and those names. That said, our district has been, for 100 years, this is our centennial year, named after Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson. And any of us who have researched and been taught history of Thomas Jefferson know that not only is it problematic, that many of our hallowed leaders in our nation and nations across the world continue to have the honor of being named for institutions which they may have had little or no connection to, if not, may actually be a contradiction to many things that our institutions stand for, especially in public sector and, of course, our government. And so, in that sense and in that spirit, I think I could speak to a few things. And I think the first thing would be to say nothing of Thomas Jefferson and any man or person's resume, nothing excuses a violation of civil and human rights and some of the things that are clearly crimes, and not only modern day, but even in his age, that he was never held accountable for. And beyond that, as a man who owned a plantation and perpetuated slavery on his plantation. In fact, with recent research, and by recent I mean not just decades, but it has been a controversy for centuries in terms of the discussion around it and acknowledging Sally Hemings, who was enslaved in her family by Thomas Jefferson. Not only that, his father of many of her children, and that was not properly acknowledged for centuries until the late 1990s, when prominent research and the oral histories and tradition of his actual family, Thomas Jefferson's actual family, descendants, wanted to assert their history and their truth, and that truth being that they are descendants of a man who held their family as slaves. So that said, in recognition of, one, history and actual truth, two, much of the research that's been done around this, and not just Thomas Jefferson, but many people who we know have held similar positions and roles in our history, in our communities. Unfortunately, these are people who have shared a collective oppressive presence in our public institutions, and the need for us to rename our communities and our community institutions is a first step. Of course, this is not a last step in considering that, because when we talk about slavery, we should be talking about reparations. When we talk about slavery and the stealing of indigenous and native land, we should be talking about land back and land rights for communities and native communities globally. But here nationally, Thomas Jefferson was in one of the first colonies in this country, and much of the land, all of the land, in fact, was unceded by Native American, unceded Native American land to our government. So that said, our district absolutely, not only do these individuals not have a right to the names of our institutions, we have a responsibility to begin the conversation and continue the conversation as school districts and cities and across all of our government to begin reimagining our communities and giving it a proper name, if that means even giving the name back to its original inhabitants. And I believe that is where I would like to start the conversation. But I have more comments and I'll reserve them for now. I do want to allow everybody the proper, this is a discussion item. So I want to hear from other trustees and of course anybody who would like to speak on it.
Anybody else, any other comments?
I think if we discussed this before, and my position hasn't changed. I've spoke many times that I don't want the district named after Jefferson. I have personal, this is my history. The Jefferson brings up a lot of strong feelings for me for a lot of different ways, how he felt about public education. One, and then his history with slavery and, fathered kids is one way. I mean, rape is another. So, but at the same time, this is in the order of importance for me. It's more important to me to focus on getting ethnic studies and our equity policy in place first, and then move on to naming. So I think that as a school board member for a very long time, I know that school districts, it's better if you focus on a singular thing, get it done, move on to the next thing, not do something that would cause a distraction, that would get in the way of doing things that I think will help people understand why we shouldn't have certain names on buildings, instead of starting with the names on buildings, instead of the educational piece that'll help people in the community and everyone understand and raise community members to understand why these things shouldn't be the way they are. So my position hasn't changed.
Any other comments?
I think Justice Sullivan kind of speaks, what she's saying, it's definitely making sense about priority here. What's our priority with regards to education? Renaming is more symbolic, I think, but what's really the work that's really behind why would we be changing the name, and what the context is, and also are we, what are going to be the resources at this time to be able to get it done. So I think we need to kind of see where we're at with that, and anyway, so that's kind of how I feel about it as well. So.
Bono, did you want to add to the conversation?
I feel like kind of, yeah, just like what they were saying, I feel like we need to work on more like the institution of schools itself and teaching students why, because I could see students not understanding it. And then maybe that being an action after, but I feel like just working in the schools itself, because a lot of students aren't aware of the actual history of things and why it's important. So,
And I would just add, actually, and the thing is, thank you for bringing up the topic, Mr. Archiventi. I do think it's important for us to at least start the conversation. I appreciate you bringing it up because I think it is something that we should recognize is an issue. But I generally agree with my colleagues that now may not be the right time. But I do think it becomes it becomes an undercurrent and perhaps a place to get to over the course of the next year as ethnic studies is rolled out. And I know you're on board with the ethnic studies piece as well, and I think we all agree with the importance of that work. And I think the potential renaming is something that becomes an undercurrent that is a natural endpoint with this discussion. So I appreciate you bringing it up. It's an important thing for us to at least mention publicly.
Yeah, I was going to say, appreciate the input. Certainly, and there may be people here who also want to speak on it, which I would encourage too. One of the things that, I think in renaming, it's not just, it's kind of like when our students, and of course our district initiated the process to remove the naming of a mascot after our Native Indigenous community. Though we as a community definitely do justice to our community and what that means, we should not be naming our mascots after people, especially those who haven't been acknowledged and honored the way they should be, the way we should be. And so it is a process. One of the things I thought about in terms of timeliness is if we're taking time to acknowledge that this is our centennial year, I can think of no better time, if there's a better time, than to initiate this process now. And by initiate, I mean not a 5-year process. We're talking about simply the naming. And with respect to resources, it's always going to be an issue. When you rename something, you're simply going to have to rebrand your business cards, the letters on the school, titles. And that certainly there are logistical issues in terms of data and bureaucracy in terms of where we register our name with the state and so on and so forth. But those are inevitable things. And so those things to me are less a question of if but when. And the second part being is this should take about a year, I would think. By the end of our centennial, we should be ready. I'm imagining that given our students and families and our community input, which is what I would advocate for, given that we are rolling out ethnic studies this year, I think this should be a part of the process where students have a voice, not just our current students, but our alumni as well. And determining what the name not only of our school district should be, but our flagship school, Jefferson. And, even thinking about Cerro Monte del Rey, Junipero Serra was himself a part of the cultural and physical genocide of Native people, not just here in the Bay Area, but throughout California. And so we think about a lot of the names in our communities. Priority isn't necessarily focusing on the name because it does say something, but it also is a point to reflect on. That said, we have been reflecting on it for over 200 years. And so as a country, I think, for a district, and I understand people agree with this, but I'm just going to say this. As a district, we've been named after this man for 100 years. And this has been a controversial issue for twice as long. We are literally on the opposite coast of the United States. If you're not familiar, Charlottesville and Monticello, where his mansion is built on, is native land, first colony, right, in the United States, what is now called Virginia. And so when we think about why our school here, and we're the only school in this area, the school district is named after, say, Thomas Jefferson. Many schools are named after the geography or something related to that, and we're not. And so I think I would like to see this, in terms of putting it into more concrete terms, is the next time we revisit this topic, because this item was presented at a late time in this school year. It is also our centennial year, so I do think it's timely that we move forward. And I would encourage people to think about this is we should have a timeline this year in terms of arriving at next winter and spring with the next steps in this process of moving forward with the name change. And it should absolutely include the input of our students, our families, our staff, of course our board, our community, and I think we should do it in concert with our partner district, the Jefferson Elementary School District, which has also expressed interest in renaming not only their school district, but many of the schools in the district, which are named after similar figures in history. And so that's one of the things I think, and I do agree, there are priorities, but I don't think it's an either or. I do believe that ethnic studies, many of our students are aware of these inequities and aware of injustice, and of course are aware of social justice and many things that come with that. I think the issue is pretty clear. We're going to change the name of our school district. So I would like us to take a next step, and I think because we're so close to the end of the school year, unless students and staff want to revisit this before the end of the school year, I would suggest that we revisit this as soon as we can in the fall, in the context of our centennial and ethnic studies, and gather that input and that feedback so we can continue this conversation, not once a semester, but ongoing, so that we can arrive next year with some change.
Well, thank you for input, and thank you for bringing up the topic, and thank you for the discussion this evening. We will, and thank you for some of the suggestions you just brought up. All right, we'll move on to item 14B, English Language Development Program updates. Ms. Bakra, and I believe Dr. Robinson, right?
Good evening, Vice President Lee. I would like to introduce Dr. Lori Robinson, who will be presenting an update for our English Language Development Program. Dr. Robinson?
Excited to be here. I get to do this presentation where I talk about our students learning English in the district about once a year. Although during last year, just because of it being the pandemic, I updated you in the beginning of the year, not in spring, so it's actually been a year and a half. And so I'm just excited to talk about the updates and what's changed and what hasn't changed, because that's important to discuss as well. So we'll go over trends, data, population shifts, all of that since the 1920 school year, staffing, some struggles and some celebrations. The intake process, which is a new thing this year and really aligns with some of the goals that I came to you with the last time, and progress monitoring that also speaks to that, particularly our next steps for our Tier 2 interventions for students learning English and those students who were recently reclassified. So jumping into the trends, I'm just going to say, you've seen this chart actually from me every time I've done this presentation. This is the cutest iteration of it because this presentation is gorgeous. But
It is.
the numbers, thank you. The numbers are really almost identical. Our district stays pretty strong, despite the numbers of the population going up and down percentage-wise. With who makes up our school district. And what really strikes me every time I look at this image is that, we have our 4 classifications of students here. And just as a brief reminder, when students first enroll in the district, they fill out something called the home language survey. And if they indicate that they speak or are spoken to in a language other than English, it automatically triggers an assessment. The initial LPAC is what that is called. And those students take that test if they're determined to already be what the state defines as fluent English proficient according to that test. They will be considered IFEP. If they are determined to need support services as on their journey to acquire English, they are considered English learners by the state. And then if they go through the process of then taking the LPAC every year and are able to hit a 4 and a few other pieces of criteria, they are considered reclassified English proficient. But what's notable to me is that either IFEP, EL, or RFEP, all of those students are, touched and impacted in their lives by a language other than English. And that's a wonderful asset that they bring into our district. And we're so fortunate to have that. I would suspect that actually for those 42% of students that are by this name, according to the state, English only, that they are also touched by a variety of languages in their lives. But that experience is in a lot of ways invisibilized, which I may have just made up that word, but it really accurately defines what happens in the experience with our students learning English, especially when you note that though our entire district is 15.6% identified as EL, which equates to about 614 students, 535 of those are at Jefferson and Westmore only. So it's a very localized experience. There are students, of course, that are touched by all different kinds of languages at Thornton, Oceana, and Terra Nova, but I think their presence isn't as immediately felt as it is in our daily city schools. And so a lot of this is being done to remind ourselves, our entire community, that they are there, they are an asset, they are part of our community pride. So that being said, though, to discuss a bit about our Newcomer Program, this is a real interesting chart for me because it helps me tell you a bit of the story of what happened during the pandemic with our students learning English. Last year, we only had 50 students come in and flag for that initial assessment total the entire year. By comparison, for this year, 21-22, we've already had 103. And that number I just pulled at the beginning of March, we've actually even had 2 tests since I pulled that number, so it's 105. And we're not even done with the school year yet. We've got a couple of students, as I'm looking over at Basuino, in pending that will be testing between now and the end of the school year. I mean, I'll be honest, we have students that test and qualify in May, the week before finals. For some students, like for example, a student we just got recently who's coming to us from Panama, Panama's school year runs from April to December. So to that student, they just finished their 10th grade year and it's April, so they've come to enroll for their 11th grade year. Maybe and perhaps not aware with the family that this is the end of our school year. And so just kind of that disconnect. So we get a lot of those students. We do get them enrolled in classes because any minute they're there interacting with their peers is beneficial. And then we also encourage them for our EL Exploration Summer School Program so that they can also dive right in. But I want to point out something. I mean, overall, we're just up in all of our numbers, which is great. But I want to point out ELD1, that is our students that have come in with the least amount of English in our Newcomer Program. And I'm very proud of myself. Kristen Ashford, our math coach, was very proud of me too, that I figured out how to calculate a percentage increase correctly. And because I really wanted to come with authority and say that this is a 336% increase in students who are identified at that level over the previous year. So that actually, though, just brings us up to about where we were in 1920. So what's interesting is last year when we were going, where are all the kids? Where are they? We were convinced that they were here and they just weren't coming in to register because of barriers of at-home learning. But because the numbers now are just coming back up to about 1920 school year level, we're wondering if they were actually not immigrating here at all. And that now immigration patterns have finally just returned to normal levels. But regardless, we're just happy that they're here finally. Where they're coming from, this is kind of a little bit of a change. 17 of the students who have recently classified are coming from Guatemala, 12 from the Philippines, 10 from El Salvador. Normally, El Salvador would be our highest country, so we've had a little bit of a shift there. I believe 7 from Honduras, 5 from Nicaragua, and 4 from Brazil and China. And so, nice variety of students coming in, and we're happy to have them. So kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, so that's the students coming in. Reclassification helps us track the students who are exiting our program for students learning English, which students should be doing with some regularity throughout the years if we're providing appropriate supports. But last year, because this is data from the 2021 school year, because it's reported by the state, and so they always just lag just a year behind, you will notice that we only had 89 students. That's a low for us. We hover in the high teens, early 20s percentage-wise. To be down at 12.9 was a huge dip in our reclassification rate, but you will see that when you compare it to the county and state totals, we were still above those, so everywhere saw a dip. The state and county both usually have a higher percentage rate for this as well. The reason for this is likely that they are triggered to go through the reclassification process by getting an overall score of 4 on the LPAC, so they have to take that LPAC exam. The LPAC exam that would have qualified them to start the reclassification process was cut short in 2020. If they started the testing season in February, they were likely to get through a lot of it, but we stopped all testing, March 13th, just like everything else stopped. So there are students that potentially would have gotten that 4 that never got the opportunity to test. And then it was also extremely difficult to track students down to get them to go through last year the other couple of measures, like they have to take a secondary proficiency exam. and such last year. So it was just a lot harder to track them down and to get them to, I mean, frankly, jump through some of the hoops that come along with the reclassification process. By comparison, already this year, we're up to 131 students who have reclassified, which is back on track with about 22%. I'm actually only disappointed with this because last year we had to give LPAC entirely on Zoom. And so there were just students that, despite our best efforts, we didn't get to in testing. And I know some of those students perhaps would have been able to get a 4 and start this reclassification process. And so we're still a little bit lagging behind because of that. This year, though, our team's back up and running. It's helpful when you have students in front of you and when they're in a better headspace, because though we're still in a pandemic, not quite at the level that we were at in spring 2021, to focus on taking things like a statewide assessment. So that's always just our general kind of data that I like to share with you about who's in our program, what are the trends with them coming in, what are the trends with them exiting. I wanted to share the college and career readiness indicators with you because this is just one of our really big LCAP goals, is to increase this number for our students learning English, because the college and career indicators actually look at so many different factors. So they're not just being seen as, did they do well on the Smarter Balance assessments or not? Because that just always seems like a singular measure and something that's really challenging for them. Whereas the college and career readiness indicators at least gives us a chance to look at some of the other factors. As you can see, this is also a comparison of 19, so we're just a year behind in the data, but 1920 compared to 2021, the 2 completed school years, looking at just senior students who have graduated that are classified as students learning English, and some of what they have accomplished in terms of meeting the criteria for being college and career ready. So the AP exams, this is one place where we fell a little short last year, probably not too much of a surprise. I want to note too that to get indicated as being college and career ready via the AP exam, they actually have to take 2 AP exams and get a 3 or above. So it's possible that maybe those numbers would be higher if they were just looking at 1, but it still is a very low number, especially, I was telling Corrine actually when I was making this chart, I was like, I'm thinking about taking off the EL graduate totals because it's just, the bars there are so high and all the other bars are so low and it's throwing off the visuals. And then I realized, oh, that's kind of the point. Our number of graduates is a lot higher than we have meeting any of these particular criteria. I do want to shout out A through G completion. I remember a time in this district where that number was 0. So the fact that we've been able to maintain in these last 2 years, 27 and 23, is pretty impressive, especially considering that because of the pandemic, a lot of students have been graduating with like state grad requirements and things like that. So that we still had that many students complete A through G is quite impressive. And so I just really want to shout out really quickly too that the CTE pathway, Denise Shreve and a lot of other teachers and counselors that help work on the CTE work really have this as a focus area. They want more students learning English, going into their classes and successfully completing that pathway. So it is a focus area. And though the data is kind of sobering, it is just a great place for us to start to say, we can only go up from here. And we'll keep tracking this, especially as, times go by. So part of what helps us achieve all these goals related to these trends that we're talking about is our staffing. And there's some to celebrate and some to kind of highlight where it's been a little bit of a struggle. So maybe starting with the struggle here. So bilingual paraprofessional, I do want to celebrate. We've been fully staffed at Westmore since last year. We're fully staffed with the bilingual paras at Jefferson as of tonight. That is today's date, 4/19 there. You just approved it in consent, Alberto Rodriguez. I'm so stoked. And that is not without help from those 2 over there and their team, by the way, who every time we even get an applicant, I'm like on the phone, I'm like, Stephanie, get them in here, trap them, test them, and then the second they pass the test, I know you've helped me with that too. I'm looking at Chelsea, and then we immediately get them for interview, and I'm calling references that afternoon. We're offering them the job. I probably scare them with how quickly I call them back. But that's because, I'm getting feedback from teachers at Westmore that are like, we love our bilingual para so much. Is there funds to hire a second? And I'm like, this is one of the first times where I'm going to look at you and say, it's not about money. I need people. Now, and that, I'm saying that, and at the same time, it is about money. Because some of the reason that we don't have the people is because of that money. It's really not that different of a story for the family liaisons. If I had been doing this presentation, I think 2 months ago, Maria Gomez's name would not be up there. And if I was doing this presentation in December, Ariana Tapia's name would not be up there. They are brand new as of this semester. Otherwise, that position has sat vacant for the rest of the school year. And that is an essential position, especially because they work so closely now with the social worker who is in place at each one of those schools. And the social workers at Jefferson and Westmore specifically have a newcomer focus to support them. But the one at Westmore is monolingual in English. And so to work with a lot of these students, she does need interpretation services. And that is something that the family liaison has been essential to help her provide. We have, as of this year, been fully staffed with the addition of Lori Collins stepping in as our student learning English TOSA at Westmore. It has just been so helpful to have her focus there, working with our teachers and helping kind of oversee placement. And Lisa Rubin continues to be the absolute powerhouse that she is. Even on maternity leave, she is watching with little Flynn right now. I didn't tell her I was giving her that shout out, but yeah, just had a baby, like 2 weeks ago? And she's watching tonight because that's how dedicated she is to this program and everything. So that has been extremely beneficial. But I just want to acknowledge that like right now, tomorrow, we'll be full staffed for the first time in 21-22. And it's made some of what I'm going to present in the next part a little bit challenging. So I wanted to set up that context as we get into the intake process, which is something that I'm here to celebrate, but also talk about like some of the potential challenges with it. So just as a really quick overview of what our process is, I've talked about this a bit. Registration happens either online or in person with assistance from our special project assistants, which is Tino, and Patty, and our new special project assistant, Gabby. And if flagged, students will take the initial LPAC, and the special project assistants will now conduct an interview. This is the new part that we have added this year. It is a very brief interview. It is not a needs assessment like a social worker might do, sit down with the family, but it is just a general intake that we can look at the form on the next slide a little bit more in depth. But it has some questions that'll help alert some folks at the site about either placement considerations or about like, okay, in the line of who's kind of waiting to work with the social worker in order to determine what kind of resources might be needed, this student might need to take a particular kind of priority. That being said, it doesn't have a lot of sensitive information in it because this information does get emailed to both the VP and the counselors when we're also reporting out on how the student did on the LPAC to let them know placement for classes. And the info sheet is even uploaded to Elevation, which is our data warehouse system that all staff has access to be able to look at it. We have gotten insanely great feedback on starting this process. Just staff, teachers feel like they already have a little bit of knowledge with the student. We're able to like address potential issues a lot more quickly, like, oh, this student's gonna need some extra TLC when they come in, because one of our goals is to have a lot warmer of a handoff. It used to be just kind of a little bit more of a factory line, I'll be honest with you, of like, okay, they register at the DO, they take the test, here's the placement information, there you go. And there's been years at the school sites where they just do fabulous things. I'm not saying that the school site hasn't held up their end of the bargain. I'm talking about the district office. It wasn't the warmest, welcome. And we've really been working hard to change that. So to help also that social worker continue on with the needs assessment to make sure that students are getting what they need. This is what the information sheet kind of looks like. It's very small, but it just has that basic kind of information. I think you have this as a part of your board packet, the thing, and you can click into this and see it in its much larger version and read all of the questions over. I also want to shout out that I stole this form, well, with permission from Samia Showman, who does my job in San Mateo Union. And she's just in general really amazing, and I'm so fortunate to have her collaborate with me. And just as a side note, she's a former JUHSD employee. She was a Jefferson teacher. So this has just been really, really helpful, especially to continue that process at the site to make sure that the site knows a little bit about the student and can make sure that they're getting what they need. So speaking of making sure and ensuring that students are getting what they need, the other thing we're doing is trying to do progress monitoring for students who are already here. So not just the students that are coming and are new to the district, but the students who have been here. And so this is happening through Elevation. Again, in your board packet, you'll have access to, if you click this, you can see a much larger version of this form, but I can tell you what's on here. It's just a form that has student information. It actually has some information about the test scores, and it goes directly to the teacher's inbox. They get an email, they click on this form. It asks them to fill out some generic questions that are actually, since these students are still classified as English learners and they'll have to take the LPAC, it actually tells them, like, since the LPAC is going to measure their skills in listening, reading, writing, and speaking, it gives them a little indication of, like, how do you think the students are doing in these particular areas? And then it suggests, hey, if the student's struggling, what do you think they'd benefit from? One-on-one tutoring, a writing workshop, peer mentoring. There's a couple of different options that are on the sheet already, so teachers can just check it off so they're not spending a ton of time filling out the form. But there is also a comment section that just says, like, what is your recommendation for the student? How can we help this student? Lori Collins monitors Westmore, Lisa Rubin monitors Jefferson, and I work with the Pacifica schools and Thornton. The 2022 focus for fall was on 9th and 10th graders. This spring, they've been working on sending out this form for 11th and 12th graders. The most common suggestions right now are writing workshops and one-on-one tutoring, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next steps and what I'm kind of considering for that. And also, just as an FYI, we have the same process in place to monitor students who have recently reclassified, because even though a student comes in, they get a 4 on the LPAC, they kind of jump through these other particular hoops, we want to make sure that once we've reclassified them, and that means we've totally taken away all English learner services and support, that they're still doing well in their classes without that support. So some next steps to kind of consider, because though I think we've made a lot of progress in these areas, we're really still far away from where I personally want to be. We need to continue to refine the process as a district, especially having a lot more collaboration. We've had a few meetings, Melissa Ambrose, the wellness counselor, district wellness counselor, and I talk constantly about this, and we've only had a few joint meetings with our intake team and the site intake team at Jefferson and Westmore, partially because of some of those staffing issues, but partially just because everybody's busy and has a million things to do. But in the meetings we have had, the feedback has been, it's just so productive to be able to talk to one another and know what's going on, because we really just need to kind of catch up and make sure a needs assessment has been done for all newcomer students, because we want to make sure we haven't missed anybody who might need to be put in touch with particular resources. And especially because the family liaisons have just been put into place at both of the sites, just really strengthening that partnership to make sure that the families, not just the student, but often the families, will have questions or need particular resources or pointed in certain directions, and that relationship is strengthened so that the family liaison can also offer that information and resources to the family. Bless you. The next steps for progress monitoring. This is the trickier one for me. So we want to continue this process. It's been really helpful to have all this information and have all this data and know that we've tracked all of these students and who we're kind of a little bit more concerned about and who we feel like they're actually doing okay, things are going well. But with this whole suggestion of the plans for the writing workshop and the one-on-one tutoring, I come back to the same conversation with Karine as I always do, which is, okay, so who and when? I can come up with great curriculum for a writing workshop. I can find a great organization that'll train people in the best practices in peer tutoring, we still need staff who are committed to doing, engaging in this work. And we're talking about a staff that's already maxed out, tapped, tired, and who frankly tell us that often, you can offer to pay me extra, and the extra pay is not worth my time and my peace of mind. And I absolutely understand that, and I absolutely get it, but it does leave us in this weird vacuum where I'm trying to figure out ways to do and complete tier 2 tasks that I know and the research tells us are best done by human beings, that the relationships that they can build and maintain while working on these things is the most important things. But I can't depend always on a human capital that's already been stretched thin and often to a breaking point. And, just another consideration too is that we have been working really hard on mainstreaming some of our students and making sure that they're in, just like in the SPED world, a less restrictive environment, that they're not spending their entire day in what we call, kind of sheltered classes or EL-specific classes, but that really is going to call for, improved teacher education and support. I'm really, really happy. Speaking of Lisa again, next year she is stepping into the role of being the job that she's done for Jefferson, but she's taking on a little bit more time to be able to take over Oceana, Terra Nova, and Thornton for me, which is excellent because I think I do my best, but it has to kind of go on my plate with everything else, and I don't always feel like I even do my due diligence by those schools. Another thing that's nice is she'll be coming off her maternity leave in fall, and I'll be going on mine. So we'll kind of tag team, and I'm really, really happy that she's going to be in that position because the district and the students learning English will be in great hands with her during that time. So I think that's all. I'm looking at Green, I'm like, I talked a lot. I think I said everything. So thank you. That's what that side says. Questions?
Congratulations.
Oh, thanks.
Best presentation ever.
Way to wrap that up.
I know how to give a finale.
I know.
Subtly slip it in, too. Under the guise of just talking about maternity leave.
Dr. Pinty?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Of course, the work that goes with that. One, I just want to say that it's good to see the data in terms of, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, but we're back on campus and seeing that our students are here and seeing them here and being able to work with them, seeing the numbers almost double with, the LPAC is really, or at least there's RFET, which is being reclassified, is really encouraging. And we know like the numbers should be higher. Of course, during COVID, it's really hard for students. And some of the things that I remember, teaching during distance learning was that a lot of our students were working and had to work, just given the pandemic, given families which sustained losses, some temporary, some permanent, and what that means in terms of our students' attendance, not just with our students who are, of course, classified in ELD, but across the entire range of students we work with. And so, I have a few questions. My first question was, I guess, that, like, have we had an opportunity to cross-reference, where our students' attendance is and has been during distance learning and even in returning to in-campus learning, where some may be working, or we're aware maybe of some of our students working, and I appreciate cross-listing with CTE. Certainly a lot of our students benefit from these programs, but maybe already working, so maybe not less interested in the academic pathway programs and segues into that, but maybe just focusing on learning English and working part-time. What are the discussion around maybe, or what have you heard in terms of that? And of course, Deputy Superintendent Locke, if you would like to chime in as well.
Yeah, you brought up something that made me realize I did forget to talk about one thing in the presentation as well. So we are seeing definitely increased rates of truancy and just like low attendance. During last year, it was quite harrowing actually to be giving some of the assessments online. And when students would turn in their cameras, there was one in particular that stands out that he was standing in front of at a cash register in his parents' convenience store, taking the LPAC while he was intermittently selling people cigarettes. So, you know, I mean, like, not the best testing environment for him probably, and also it was just humbling to witness. And yes, absolutely, there are students who are maintaining that issue throughout, that the parents simply said, yeah, I can't afford to send you back to school, essentially, and having to make that decision. So one of the things that Lisa and Mr. Bashirs, the principal of adult programs, and I got to do in the beginning of December, I believe, is go down to San Mateo Union, so SAMIA, again, our collaboration. They have a program there called the Bridge Program that's specifically designed for students who come in and are those ELD1 students that we were identifying before, but who are a little bit older, who definitely also fit that bill where they have to maintain work. And they're also going to have a really rough path to graduation, especially if they're coming in without transcripts because maybe they've had significant interrupted like formal education or something along those lines. And so Bridge is designed to try and get them a pathway towards a diploma of some sort, you know, like looking a little different. But it is also a half-day program so that they can still access food, mental health. The day we were visiting, she actually had a mobile clinic come in and they were vaccinating kids. Like it was all kinds of wraparound services, but also they ended at noon. So students were more likely to attend because they could work that into their job schedule a little bit more. And so Mr. Bashirs was really excited about it, as were we, but it would kind of be housed in the adult school realm of things because it would also ideally make a pathway towards his programs because he has a lot of programs in adult school for you know, adults that are acquiring English still, and things that these students might be soon. And so we are in the process of looking at bringing a program like that to JUHSD. It's finding the right teachers, so it goes back to the human capital problem. Yeah. But I mean, we don't give up. And like I said, I'm looking over here. I was like, and neither does Dana, and neither does Doreen. So you know, we will chug along. We will figure it out. But we're hoping to start that in 22-23.
Yeah, see, to follow up, thank you for that. And I know there's a process in the program that is wondering where students can plug in. And to that effect, when they're first coming here in the intake process, one of the things that crossed my mind that we hear about sometimes is that, you know, it's hard to assess them in terms of their needs and in terms of special education. Sometimes just students across the board have such like low grade levels. It's really hard to assess that, and especially when language is a factor, even harder. And so I'm aware that there is an alternate LPAC in development at the state level. I'm not sure if you have any discussions or heard anything about that and where that might be in terms of assessing that and where our students might be in terms of gauging where some students may need more accommodations and how we're providing those with staff who may or may not have training in special education.
Yeah, it's been really a great experience working with Grace Ventura and Lee Medvedoff, our directors of special education. Particularly, Lee Medvedoff has the fortunate experience of having all the testing under his particular umbrella, so I bother him constantly. And yeah, a lot this year because the alternative LPAC for the summative LPAC was an operational field test this year. So we did actually give it. All of our students took the summative. They have not yet done the field testing for the initial, so to actually assess student for the alternative assessment, although we really, in our district, have not had to do that. That is something that often they see more in the elementary school districts when they're identifying. A lot of the time, students coming in, even from out of country, will already have an IEP for a few of the students, or they came in during middle school, and so we're getting both their EL status and their IEP as an incoming student there. But it will be helpful to have access to that. The case managers, as far as I've had it reported to me, said that the alternative LPAC was pretty smooth, pretty easy to administer because it follows really the same platform as the CASP. So they are familiar with doing a similar testing style. So the training was pretty easy, and they reported that it was pretty simple to give. And so we'll have to see what the results of that and what the guidance from the state continues to be with that.
Right on. It's good to know. That's good. This is my last question, and just going back to kind of a main, sticking point there is staffing. I'm glad that we are fully staffed at Westmoreland because our numbers are up in terms of, just our students returning to school and our students from many countries. One of the things in the LCAP, and I'm glad you pointed out, is, with our family liaisons, our TOSAs and many of the positions that we're looking at here, social worker and our bilingual pairs. Those are things that I know we've seen, we've invested, and we've talked about and discussed it and seen the results and the impact they've had in our district. And so I'm glad that we're pushing for that. I think it absolutely needs to be part of the discussion with our LCAP ongoing in terms of expanding room for that. Bilingual pairs, I know I brought this up in other venues in our meetings, but in terms of just bilingual staff, in terms of professional development. Myself, I wasn't raised bilingual, but I'm learning Spanish. So I need to, practice that. And so for our teachers and our staff in gen ed and special ed, areas who are not teaching ELD, at least not yet, are we looking at any professional development? I mean, I'm sure teachers look into this, but where are we in terms of encouraging more bilingual training? Because we have staff, obviously, but their capacity, a lot of us are, stretched thin as educators, but I think that would be one of the most valuable things for educators, and certainly in other districts around our state and our country, there's more of an incentive maybe because those are the students the communities are working with. And so where are we in terms of maybe encouraging or supporting that professional development?
Not as far as we should be. I also really would advocate for that. I mean, I'm also pretty advanced in learning Spanish at this point because I don't want to be the only one in my family that doesn't speak it, especially once the son comes along. And then, I don't want them talking behind my back. And through the process of that, I agree with you. The amount of empathy and just understanding that I have gained through that process has been invaluable. I will say, though, that along the lines of the staffing, it's not just in our classified positions that we're having some difficulties. It's in ELD teaching right now. They recently started tracking. I would say it's not a change in the law as much as they recently started tracking this a little bit more. So it came to our attention that the credential programs no longer give a CLAD certification. They give an ELAS now that allows you to teach an ELD class. You can teach English learners in your mixed class, but you can't teach specifically ELD unless you get an ELA1 credential. The only way to get that is to take a very expensive class that is only offered by, I believe, University of Phoenix, or to take a very expensive test that does not always have the highest pass rate. So we are doing what we can as a district to help support teachers to get through all of that certification so we could just even have the teaching staff. I think down the line, I would love, though, to, once we kind of manage some of those hurdles and get the people in the building, absolutely encourage them to acquire a second language, I think would be a great goal. I think bilingualism and multilingualism, for that matter, is an asset, like I said, to everyone, to the staff, to our community, to learning, life, travel. So yes.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions?
Yeah, I have some. So first, they're always going to talk behind your back. There's nothing you can do to stop them from talking behind your back.
Oh yeah, I
Sorry.
know.
Yeah.
But I have a pretty sharp tongue too, so.
I've walked into rooms and I'm like, they're all having a little huddle, and I'm like, oh God. Second, and seriously, for the slide that had the college and career readiness indicators, I know that this is foundational, right? Like, we have really started this focus in the past couple of years, so understanding that this is foundational and how to grow. Has there been any outreach to the 3 people that did pass the AP to see, what was successful and what could they have used, any other assistance that maybe would help with future students? And that's the same with the CTE students, et cetera, A to G.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. There hasn't been. I think my obsession has been more with the fact that part of the reason that I think that there's only 3 is that I don't think a lot of them are enrolled in the class to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So we're already talking about a really small sample size, and then on top of it, take the test and be able to get a 3 or above is really hard. So that's been more where Bach and I have had a lot of our conversations in a lot of those, actually, because it's not just then the AP enrollment. It's been really focusing on the A through G enrollment, because it starts with enrollment, and then it's on the student, and grades and completion and all of that. But a lot of these things we were looking at and were really just even a barrier with them getting in the door. With CTE courses as well. There was, once upon a time where it was they couldn't take the particular assessment that they needed to for safety in this class. And it was like, let's figure out a way to get around that barrier so that they can actually participate in this. So it's been more focused on that, but it is a good suggestion to look at like, okay, let's look at our successes and, figure out how we can replicate that instead of always just focusing on where the students aren't.
Yeah, like we got 3, like how do we double it? And then in terms of priority, I know we'll have a longer discussion on Saturday, so this is more of just like highlighting the discussion for Saturday. That is something that I really want to focus on in looking at fatigue and burnout, and then where do we prioritize our efforts? Because I know we try to be everything to everybody all the time, and we just cannot sustain that anymore, especially with everything that's going on around us. So how do we focus on, or is it possible to focus on a few priority areas, with this, of course, being one of them, because, knowing definitely what our students need to succeed outside of JUHSD, having a handle on the language of the country that they're living in is extremely important. So this is one area, but we can't do that if you're not going to be able to get people high-end. The highest currency that we have in this JUHSD is our human. And if that is not, if that's not present, even though there's bodies here, but it's not present, that's not going to be helpful for us. And so, how do we re-engage and maybe reinvest that human currency and this and other things, and what do we need to drop? So.
Yeah, it's a huge focus area for me, and I will admit, not one I've always had. I think in the past I have fallen victim to that mindset of tapping the people I tapped, and pushing that to its limits. So it's a new intellectual challenge to figure out how to accomplish things and be more strategic about what we use when. But I think it's an important conversation to have in a lot of arenas.
And then I am very happy that we have like the social worker, and how connected are they to the Daly City Youth Health Center, and so that we can have as much wraparound services as possible. And so that's just more another comment to toss out there, because we are re-engaging the health center and getting them more on campus and more present. So how do we use them, especially since we invested so much of our finite resources into that institution? So.
Yeah. And they absolutely are. I actually am so regretful. I'm like looking at the camera. I'm like, Lisa, what's her name? There's an intern that actually works with the Daly City Youth Health Center that's at Jefferson this year, that like is even helping doing that intake and doing the needs assessment. And they are just Lexi, okay, he knows, yes. Who they just are raving about. They're saying it's just so wonderful. So yeah, that partnership has, and because Melissa, she's gonna work every single angle that she possibly can. She's like, when I talked to her about that bridge program, she's like, I'll staff you with interns for that, and like help getting the behavioral support and mental wellness and all of the different things. And so yeah, it's been really really great to work with them. So some of that has been leveraged. It can always be added to with more.
And then just thank you. This program is one of the things I'm really proud about, being part of this district. So I know it's been a rough 2 years. It's been hard on everybody, but I'm glad to see that we're still really focused, and the outcomes for me are as positive as I think they could be. So thank you.
I inherited it from Baca, and my main job was to just not screw it up. I think I've mostly done okay.
I think you're doing yeah, definitely a positive job. And President Tejada also just shot me a text just to say congratulations as well.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, I know it's probably too early, but it'd be interesting to see what impact the Jefferson 4x4 schedule has on this as well compared to the other schools.
Yeah.
I mean, is there any early return that you've seen so far, or is it just too soon at the moment?
And this is another thing where I wish I had Lisa here, because she could speak a little bit better to that. But I think one of the reasons that the 4x4 was proposed was to help these students, both because really focusing on 4 classes when you're talking about some of those students that are going to work in the evening, like only having to balance 4 classes worth of homework at a time, things like that, it's really beneficial. But really the credit recovery that they're able to do during the school day. So again, if they have those after school commitments, it has been really beneficial. I know that there have been students that have a pathway towards graduation that did not probably have that before, at least in the same kind of a timeline. I would have to get exact numbers from
Okay.
her, so I can put that in a future weekly update.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I think if there's nothing else, I think we can move on to the next time. Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson,
All right,
and
thank you.
congratulations once
Yes,
again.
thanks.
All right, next we have item 14C, report on demographics and enrollment projections. Ms. Van Raphorst.
Thank you, Vice President Lee. The board approved a contract with Schoolworks in November of 2021 to provide updated demographic and enrollment projections, and we are very fortunate to have Mr. Ken Reynolds from Schoolworks here tonight to walk you through their findings.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with the board this evening to share the findings from our demographic study. And we've done these studies for the district in the past, so this is an update, but I still want to refresh you on all the information. So I think it's been about 3 years since I've been here last, so a whole pandemic ago. But it is a challenging time to do projections, trying to understand all the impacts that have happened over the last 2 years. So again, we're doing our best. Again, our job is to do a projection to try and illustrate where we believe your enrollment is heading in the future. Unfortunately, we don't control it. We're just doing our best to predict it. And so the methodology we use looks at a lot of different data from your district, from your feeder districts, from the development community, from birth data. Lots of information goes into our analysis. And so this chart here just shows all those different matrices that come together. And we end up with 2 various results. One of them looks at who lives in a school boundary, and the other looks at who attends the school. And so I'll explain a little bit more about those details as we show you some of the charts. So again, we do use a geographic information system when we do our analysis. So we have all of your data and the feeder data loaded into our mapping system for the last 4 years for this particular analysis, but we have even older data from work we've done with you in the past. And so again, we're just showing here a map of the district. You can see the red dots where all the different families live. So one of the key enrollment factors for a high school is looking at those feeder elementary schools. So on this chart here, we're showing you the total enrollment by grade in your feeder districts as of this year, and in comparison to what your enrollment is for your high schools in green for this year. So we can see your largest class is in 12th grade this year, and it's been that way for a while. In fact, when we look at the older data, the last 2 years we've been graduating pretty large classes. And so we have smaller incoming classes, as you can see. When we look at the upcoming data, we do see a decent-sized 8th grade, but another factor that's important to know is when we compare how many 8th graders in your elementary districts to how many freshmen enroll in your schools, we lose about 60. So it drops about 60. That's the average cohort factor. We do see a really small class in the elementary districts in 7th grade. And so again, we're going to see some various size classes come in over the next few years. So here we can see the historic enrollment. Again, the data we report on is as of October each school year. So it's good to note that that's the time frame we're reporting on. And again, here's where you can see the large senior classes in 2019 and 2020 that we're graduating. And we can see we're bringing in smaller freshman classes. And so that's the real source of the decline in enrollment you've seen, is we're just graduating more students than we're bringing in out of the freshman class from our feeder districts. So here's the overall summary of our total numbers. What we show here is 10 years of historic enrollment And it shows where we've seen those numbers dropping. And there was a pretty big drop this year, again, just when we compare that large senior class compared to the small incoming freshman class. And then we do our projections for the next 6 years. And again, those numbers are continuing to drop, mostly because we're seeing some drops in enrollment in your elementary districts. And we're seeing that across the state. We're really seeing it across the Bay Area region. And the key factor, if you look at our statewide number of births occurring, it is dropping significantly. From 2015 to 2020, we lost about 100 births per year across the state. So again, families are just having smaller families. They're waiting later in their life to begin their families, and there's just fewer families having children. And again, we've been watching that trend. When we look again, statewide data, our largest number of births occurred in the year that generates this year's freshmen and sophomores. So again, statewide, we're going to be seeing the high school populations decline just from the natural cycle of the birth rates. And we've not seen that number turn around ever since, we're going on basically 15 years now. Those numbers have been continuing to drop. We thought we'd see maybe a bounce up during the lockdown, but that didn't occur. So we're still watching the data, hoping that something changes that cycle, but it's not happened yet. So when we show our enrollment projections, which we'll be showing next, we do show a capacity line on our charts, and we calculate capacities based on our classroom counts and a loading standard per classroom. In the reality, when we have high schools and master schedules, capacities can be quite a challenging component. We're just showing a simple reference here so we can understand our enrollments and do we have adequate room for our students. In our actual report, we do have a page for each individual campus that will highlight students with red dots if they live in that boundary and attend the school, and a blue dot if they live in the boundary but attend a different school in the district. And then we have yellow dots outside of that area if they're transferring into that campus from another boundary within the district. And we'll show the green dots if they're transferring out from outside of the school district. So again, it just gives you a good understanding of the attendance patterns. And then, of course, we do have a bar chart in addition to the colored dots that illustrate, yellow is the students coming into that campus and blue are the students leaving the campus. And so, again, we are going to see several students leaving each of the campuses to go to Oceana because it does not have a boundary. But other than that, there are just some transfers between campuses. And so for each of our high schools, this is what our charts look like when we're doing our detailed projections by school site. We have 4 years of historic enrollment. In actual red, it shows our attendance as of October, whereas blue shows how many students live in the boundary. And all of our demographics are based on those neighborhood analysis, which are represented by the blue line. And then, of course, we have the black line representing our capacity. And again, with a decline in enrollment, capacity is not really an issue at this point in time. At Jefferson High School, we are seeing a drop in enrollment. And again, a lot of that is just the smaller incoming classes. Whereas our next school at Terra Nova, relatively stable, just a slight decline. And here we do see the difference between that blue line, the students that live in their boundary, versus their actual enrollment. And of course, the Oceana campus is located within that school's boundary. And so that's its biggest draw. Of course, location is always a critical factor when choosing your high school. And then next is Westmore. Here again, we've been seeing some declining enrollment, but into the future, the numbers aren't declining as much. So the decline is not as significant in the feeder schools for Westmore as it was for Jefferson. And then, of course, Oceana. Here what we do, right, we don't have a blue line here. It doesn't have a boundary. What we do is we look at the overall district demographics, and we look at that school's attendance patterns. How many ninth graders are we attracting from the Jefferson area? How many 10th graders are we attracting from the Westmore area? So we're looking at it regionally by grade level to see what the participation rate is in the students that are choosing to attend Oceana. And we assume those patterns continue into the future. If the program is expanding or changing, obviously you have a new principal, there can be some adjustments. And so that is something we'll have to watch over time in case there is some changing in their patterns. And of course, Thornton, again, we use the same methodology as we do for Oceana with the students that are participating in that program. We do have an attendance matrix, so you can see some more details about where the students live versus where they're attending. And again, based on our review right now, we have adequate space at every campus. A lot of times these details are needed if you're ever in the unfortunate situation of needing to adjust boundaries to relieve overcrowding, which is something that is not on our horizon. I think another good thing to look at, especially when we're talking equity, is the enrollment by campus. You've got two campuses that are relatively similar sizes, and then two that are much smaller. And of course, that creates some opportunities and perhaps some challenges in the fiscal operations and program offerings. And so again, this just visually represents the overall enrollment when we compare the campuses to each other. We do have various reports showing details for perhaps staffing purposes or individual site principals so they can understand what's happening at their schools. The top chart shows the overall enrollment numbers by grade level, and then the bottom chart shows it by campus, and those charts are both showing all the numbers for the next 6 years. And then finally, we always wrap up with a utilization chart where we compare our capacity to our enrollment in our 6-year projection. And we would highlight something in red if we were worried about being overcrowded. And we do not have that situation to be concerned about. And then again, that just talks about we do work only in California, and we've worked with districts all over the state. Again, a lot here in the Bay Area, a lot here on the peninsula, and again, across the state. So with that, I'd love to be able to answer any questions.
Open it up for questions. Mr. Oxpinty?
Thank you for that presentation. One thing about, I think, looking at statistics is we use the best data we have now, and like you mentioned in the beginning, it's been 3 years, and I may have asked this question before, but one of my first impressions is obviously because of the impact of the current pandemic, right? And at whatever stage we are now, projecting what that might look like, there are so many uncertainties and variables in that we couldn't have foreseen the pandemic itself, obviously. That said, where do you see some of the impacts, or what kind of attributable factors do you see in the current projections or the current status based off of the current actual enrollment and the projections from 3 years ago? Where do you feel those impacts came from due to COVID or, like you said, birth rates and whatnot?
Well, some of the most interesting things that we've seen in analyzing this data over the last 2 years, we've seen more impacts at our elementary schools than we've seen in high schools. And my thought on that, again, based on all the numbers we've seen, is that families are typically more connected at the high school level than they are when they're in elementaries. And so, because what we saw during the pandemic was a change in mobility and an increase in mobility. And so obviously, you've seen reports out of the news saying, oh, everyone's leaving California, going to Arizona or Texas or Tennessee or wherever. And yeah, there is mobility that occurs. I don't think it is much different than what's normal. I think there were some accelerated choices that were made, but again, most of that impacted the elementary students. Because of those connections at the high school levels, we saw that high school numbers across the state not impacted much, whereas at the elementary grades, we saw some significant drop-offs. And part of that makes sense, right? While we had to have the lockdown and we had to learn virtually, it's relatively, I think, doable for a high school student. Trying to get a 4 or 5-year-old or 6-year-old to be able to learn off a tablet, that's much more complicated and challenging. So again, those changes in mobility, I think, accelerated some of the trends that are already occurring, but it was less pronounced at the high school level. Our bigger concerns looking forward are what new trends are going to occur, right? There was a lot of drop in mobility into our state and the country. A lot of the countries were locked down, so there wasn't as much international mobility. So we should see a pickup in those numbers over the future. And then the economy is also a big driving factor. Is there going to be a change in the economy that impacts the numbers? Because one of the analysis we've done, again, across the Bay Area, is looking at the students generated by new housing developments. And those numbers are dropping. And part of it you could blame on the fewer number of births occurring, but we've also seen very strong correlations between home prices and yield rates. As home prices increase, yield rates have been dropping. And there is a strong correlation in that. So if prices continue to skyrocket and houses are not affordable, we're not going to see as many children as we would have historically expected.
Accurate, yeah. Thank you for that. I think, that's one of the reasons why I ask. I think there are so many variables, right, in terms of the pandemic. We were just mentioning earlier, right? We have students who are working with, an outflux of people from even essential work. And all work is essential, but especially low-wage jobs that high school students could access a little easier, and even higher-paying jobs with family depending on them. High school students have a little more flexibility, and so they might have alleviated some of those things, but the impacts, of course, the losses, we can't account from just by looking at the GIS analysis, but your input is very valuable in seeing where that might correlate. I guess my second question would be, in terms of the graduation rate, I feel like the slide, I can refer to which slide it is. It was the graduation rates, the bar, I believe it's slide 4.
Not the graduation rates, but just the senior enrollment.
Maybe it's let me see, it's one of these slides.
Slide 4 was showing the current enrollment by grade level and showing how the senior class is your largest class this year.
That's what it is. And so, when you're referring to the impact with our feeder schools, right, in terms of those numbers, does anything in the data that you've seen indicate that students are maybe returning to our district for high school, having left, or that they're just simply leaving or not being born, or not enough, the birth rate is still low, and that our students are in fact just graduating elsewhere?
Right, and that's a great question. We're going to be able to do more of an analysis of that impact this fall. And basically, we don't go out there and interview, knock on every door and find out, how many high school age kids do you have and how many are enrolled in the Jefferson district and how many are choosing other options.
Right.
But what we do have access to is the more detailed census data that will be released this fall. And that will tell us how many children by age lived within your school boundaries as of March, April of 2020. When we compare that to your student data, we can then do an analysis and see how many students lived in your area that did not go to your schools. And so based on that data, then we can come back and let you know where those numbers are and how that compares to where those numbers were 10 years ago during the last census. And so we can see if you're have improved in terms of your overall capture of the total population, or have been stable or changed. So, yeah, for all of our clients we're working with right now, when that data is released this fall, we'll be issuing basically a one-page update to let you know, is there more students you can attract to your programs because there's a significant population that's not enrolled here. And again, there's a typical ratio that attends either private schools or charter schools. And it's going to be interesting to see if there's a increased numbers because of those that have chosen to go to homeschools or, chose a homeschool option.
That actually, my last question is in terms of independent study, and there are schools which operate online, and some districts have them, some don't. There are state programs as well, and I know Deputy Superintendent Baca, your familiarity with this as well, if you want to chime in. Like in terms of those trends, have you seen anything outside of our district that reflects the trends in our district where perhaps we're losing some of those students to those programs? We're not losing them, but they're transitioning into those programs instead.
Yeah, and we saw a lot of those programs during 2020 and even 2021. And some districts were very successful with that option. In all the data we've been looking at, those numbers are returning to the pre-pandemic normals. So I think there was a short time trend there, but I'm not seeing any long-term changes in all the data we've seen so far.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions?
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, and that we have our budget meeting again on Saturday to think about in terms of budgeting and staffing and programming, and how much sense it makes to keep, like, how do we keep certain programs in schools that are possibly going to be 500 or 600 below. I mean, so those are the things that I'm thinking about. The other thing that I'm thinking about too is that, and I've said at a previous meeting, the eviction moratorium courts have been extremely backed up. And so those are gonna start hitting in the summer possibly. So that there may be more shifting that we're not aware of that could possibly, so it'll be good that we're revisiting this in the fall. I think it's also good to see that while there is a lot of certain groups staying in certain areas, that we are truly an open school district and there is a lot of movement, because that's what we want. I want parents and students to pick the school that best matches them and that we have unique schools for a reason. So that's also helpful for me to see here, that it is actually reflected in attendance, and that, especially like who's going to each school, that chart for me is really helpful to see the attendance of what school they're going to and what actual boundaries they live in. So this is just all something I'm going to keep my eye on moving forward. And lastly, I mean, I'm a huge housing advocate, and this is just another reason why we all need to rethink housing. And this is not just specific to us, but the county as a whole. It is just almost impossible to live here and try to have a family, if you're not making over $150,000 a year. And that's like barely minimum, barely average. Like, you're just not poor if you're making 150 year round. And so that to me is insane, especially when we're looking at the families that we serve. How can we continue to be a district that serves families if families can't afford to live here? So the San Francisco problem is spreading, south, and it's just something to keep in mind.
Thank you for the information. It's very helpful. My first reaction was, I'm just grateful we are a basic aid district. That was, so that was my thank you that we're community funded. On the other hand, also just knowing that interest rates just went up a little bit. So We don't know yet what the impact will be in terms of our funding longer term, if there's a slowdown in if there were to be a slowdown in home sales and property turnover. So I'm grateful that we've consistently budgeted far more conservatively. Thank you, Ms. Van Raphorst. It's interesting, as you were speaking, I did take a look back at your last demographic study from a few years ago, and it was interesting to see that the seventh graders that you mentioned were the third graders in that study, and that was that one year where it was unreasonably low, and we're just seeing it roll right through now. So that was kind of interesting to see. And clearly, we couldn't have predicted a pandemic at the time because, just seeing what the projections were then versus what they are now, because reality's been so different to us the past 2 years. But thank you for making it clear that the birth rate really has been probably the single largest driving factor in the decline, but that we do obviously have some other social factors that are probably certainly contributing to quite more adversely than we realized. So I don't have any other comments, but thank you. This is, again, for me, a lot to think about.
I agree with the having children later and social and economic, impact on why we all have less children and like everything you said was like, okay, I guess I'm not the only one.
No, Carla, you're not alone.
I am not the only one. And yes, if I could afford to have more children, I might. I'm considering.
We don't need you to populate the district. That's okay.
I know. Other people would like for me to populate more. Me? It makes a difference. But thank you for the report. Sorry, I had a little, making a little comment.
And then the other thing too, like we're community funded, but the only reason why we're community funded is because the state lowered the bar, right?
Right.
So it's not like we're flush of cash,
No,
right?
no.
It's only because the state lowered the bar, and so lots of school districts around here are community funded now that were not 10 years ago. So,
Exactly. So there we go. All right. So let me start the committee. One more comment.
I just have one question. Just lastly, I noticed the map. Looking at a lot of the districts that you work with in Central Valley and the demographic trends in our state, are you seeing an expansion of enrollment or an increase in enrollment in many along the coast in the Central Valley, or at least the Central Valley?
We're not really seeing increases anywhere. The only real increase we're seeing is that creation of TK as a full grade. So that is stemming the declines for some districts. But yeah, we're not, even Dublin here in the Bay Area, they're seeing a little bit of growth, but they doubled their enrollment over 10 years. And now they're just pretty stable. If it wasn't for the increase in TK, they wouldn't be growing. So yeah, it's the yield rates are higher in the Central Valley, the farming communities where it's still more affordable.
Good.
But that's the only real difference.
Thank you.
All right. We'll move on. Thank you so much for the presentation. And item 15A1, JUHSD AFT 14-1 contract negotiations proposal for the 22-23 school years. Ms. Lujan.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you. What you have before you in this item is the initial proposals from the Jefferson Union High School District and AFT 1481. I do want to call out that there is a typo on the agenda that I didn't catch till this evening. The recommended motion references the 21 through 24 negotiation cycle, which we have already fixed. We're actually opening up 22, 23. And I welcome any questions you may have.
Right. If seeing none, this is an action item. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right, and now item 14A2 for the Teamsters 856 contract negotiation proposal. Ms. Lujan, once again.
Hello again. What you have before you are the initial proposals from Teamsters and Jefferson Union High School District. This is correctly published for the 21 through 24 negotiation cycle. It would be our intention to settle negotiations, and then as needed, we can reopen additional years as needed.
Okay. Again, another action item. Is there a motion to approve?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, thank you very much. Item 16, consideration of future agenda items. All right, so we'll move on to the adjournment. Before we do so, we adjourn tonight's meeting in honor of Andy Parodi. Andy Parodi was born in San Francisco on March 20th, 1926, and raised in Daly City. He attended Jefferson High School and was the president of the sophomore class. With his desire to join the U.S. Marine Corps, Andy graduated from high school early in 1943. While in the U.S. Marine Corps, Andy was selected for aviation with the 4th Marine Division. After completing his service, Andy attended San Jose State University, and upon completion of his degree, he fulfilled a long career working in insurance. Later in life, Andy co-founded the Veterans Memorial Golf Tournament, which to date has raised over $450,000 for the Palo Alto Veterans Administration's Polytrauma Center. Andy's father, John Parodi, was employed by the JUHSD in 1942, where he first worked as head gardener at Jefferson High School and also later at Westmore High School. John retired in 1962. Andy Parodi passed away on February 24th, 2022, at 95 years old. He is survived by his wife Ethel, his 4 children Mary, Roseanne, Johnny and Stephanie, and 9 grandchildren. We, the Jefferson Union High School Board of Trustees, send our condolences to Mr. Parodi's family, friends, and a host of loved ones. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Favor?
Aye.
Meeting adjourned, 8:35 p.m.